worst date story. You know how sometimes life throws you a curveball just when you think you've got things figured out? That's pretty much what happened to me when I met Melissa. She was a friend of a friend. One of those chance encounters that you don't think much of at the time. It was a random Saturday night, the kind where you don't have any big plans, but end up out with your buddies at some bar downtown. I wasn't expecting anything special, just a night of drinks and laughs, but that's when Melissa walked in. She had this energy about her, the kind that pulls you in before you even know what's happening. Not drop-dead gorgeous, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made you want to pay attention. She had this wild, curly hair that framed her face like it had a mind of its own, and a smile that made her eyes light up in a way that was just, I don't know, magnetic. We started talking, and it wasn't long before we were hitting it off like we'd known each other for years. She had a quick wit, and I found myself laughing at her dry, sarcastic humor, the kind that's always a little sharper than you expect. So, I did what any guy in my situation would do. I got her number. We exchanged a few texts over the next couple of days. Nothing too serious, just feeling things out. But there was definitely a vibe there, and I didn't want to let it fizzle out. So I suggested we go out for dinner later that week. Just a casual thing, but I was looking forward to it. The day of the date rolls around, and I get a text from Melissa. She tells me her grandpa just passed away. Now, I'm no expert on how to handle these kinds of things, but I figured she'd want to reschedule. Losing someone is heavy, and I didn't want to put any pressure on. I told her it was fine, that we could meet up another time when she was feeling better. Then she surprised me. She said she still wanted to go out. She mentioned she was new to the city and just didn't want to be alone. I understood that. Sometimes you just need a distraction. Something to take your mind off the pain. So I agreed, knowing that the night might be a little more somber than I had originally planned. But man, I was not prepared for what was about to unfold. We met up at this little Italian place downtown, one of those cozy spots with dim lighting and checkered tablecloths. I got there a few minutes early, and when she walked in, it was clear she was already pretty far gone. She was tipsy. To put it lightly, she wobbled a bit as she walked over to the table, and when she sat down, she gave me this grin that was somewhere between flirty and drunk. I tried to keep things light, asking her about her day and whatnot, but it was clear from the start that this wasn't going to be your average date. She ordered a drink right away, some kind of cocktail, and downed it like water. Before I even had a chance to finish my first glass of wine, she was ordering another round. Now, I'm not one to judge. I've had my fair share of nights where I've gone a little too hard, especially when things in life aren't going so great. So, I just rolled, figuring she needed this night more than I did. But the more she drank, the more the conversation took a turn I didn't see coming. At first, we talked about the usual stuff. Work, life in the city, how we both ended up here. But then, out of nowhere, she started talking about how she was bisexual. It wasn't exactly what I expected to come up in conversation. Especially not on a first date, but I didn't mind. I mean, it's 2024. People have all kinds of stories, right? I just wasn't sure where she was going with it. She kept bringing it up, weaving it into every topic we talked about. At one point, I asked her how long she'd been in the city, and she somehow connected that to a story about her ex-girlfriend. Then she jumped to a memory of some guy she dated, only to loop it back to another girl she had a fling with. It was like her mind was stuck on a loop. And no matter where the conversation started, it always ended up in the same place. By the time she was on her fourth drink, keep in mind we hadn't even gotten our entrees yet, I realized this wasn't just about her grandpa passing. There was something else going on, something deeper that she wasn't saying out loud. She kept looking around the restaurant like she was searching for someone or something, her eyes a little too wide, her smile a little too forced. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, asking her about her job, her hobbies, anything to break the cycle, but she wasn't having. She was locked into this strange narrative, bouncing between stories about her exes and throwing in random, almost philosophical musings about sexuality. It was like she was trying to convince herself of something, or maybe she was trying to see how I'd react. It was clear she was hurting, and maybe this was her way of coping. I just wasn't sure what to do. The more she drank, the more animated she got, her voice rising a little too loudly for the intimate setting we were in. People at nearby tables were starting to glance over, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of weird performance, where I was the audience and she was the star, playing out some inner turmoil I couldn't quite understand. When the food finally arrived, I hoped it might sober her up a bit. but she barely touched her plate. Instead, she ordered yet another drink, and I started to get that sinking feeling in my stomach, the one you get when you know things are going off the rails, but you're not sure how to stop it. She kept going, talking in circles, her words slurring more with each passing minute. At one point, she leaned across the table, her face inches from mine, and asked me if I thought she was attractive. It wasn't a playful question. There was something desperate in the way she asked it, like she needed validation in that moment more than anything else. I told her she was beautiful, which was the truth, but I don't think she believed me. She just nodded, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place, then leaned back in her chair with a sigh. By the end of the night, she was too drunk to even stand on her own. I ended up calling her an Uber, making sure she got home safe. As I watched the car drive away, I couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and confusion. This wasn't how I'd imagined our night going at all. What was supposed to be a fun, light-hearted date had turned into something much darker, something I wasn't sure I knew how to handle. As I walked back to my car, the night air felt cold against my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed someone unraveling right in front of me. And the worst part was, I had no idea how to help. After the disaster that was dinner, I should have called it a night, but something in me just couldn't leave Melissa like that. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just plain curiosity about where this roller coaster was headed. Either way, I suggested we meet up with some mutual friends who were out nearby. I figured it'd be better to have other people around, give me some backup, and maybe bring her down from whatever emotional high she was riding. Safety in numbers, right? We ended up at this low-key bar, the kind with neon lights and a sticky floor, where the music's loud enough to drown out awkward conversations, but not so loud that you can't hear yourself think. By the time we walked in, Melissa was swaying on her feet, holding onto my arm like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Our friends spotted us and waved us over, a mix of relief and surprise on their faces when they saw her condition. I thought being around familiar faces might help her calm down, but I was dead wrong. Instead, the presence of our friends seemed to fuel something in her, like she was playing to an audience. Almost immediately, the conversation took a sharp turn. I could feel her eyes on me, a strange intensity in them that hadn't been there earlier. She leaned in close, her breath heavy with the smell of alcohol, and started talking about how she wanted to take me home. Now, I'm no saint, but even I could see the red flags waving in my face. She was blackout drunk, barely making sense, and I'd only had a few drinks myself. I knew if I went along with it, I'd be taking advantage of her in a state where she couldn't really make decisions. So I tried to let her down easy, told her it wasn't the right time, that we should get her home safe first. But she wasn't having any of it. Her expression darkened, and she pulled back like I'd slapped her. For a second, I thought she was going to cry, but then the anger took over. She started ranting, loud enough that our friends fell silent, turning their attention to her as she unleashed a drunken tirade about how I was a terrible person for rejecting. She kept asking everyone around the table why they thought I was such a bad guy, saying that I was the reason she'd never find love. The whole thing was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Our friends were frozen, not sure how to respond. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with awkward smiles, like they weren't sure if this was serious or just another one of those drunk Melissa moments. But this felt different. There was a bitterness in her voice, a desperation that made the whole thing uncomfortable as hell. At that point, I knew I had to get out of it. There was no talking her down, no reasoning with someone in that state. So I stood up, told her we should call it a night, and offered to get her a ride home. But she refused, insisting she was fine, even though it was clear she wasn't. I looked around at our friends, silently pleading for someone to step in. Thankfully, one of her close girlfriends, Sarah, caught the hint. She got up and gently took Melissa by the arm, guiding her away from the table and out the door. I watched them leave, feeling a mix of relief and regret. Relief that the night was finally over, and regret that it had spiraled so far out of control. There was a part of me that wanted to follow them, to make sure Melissa was okay, but I knew there was nothing more I could do. This was a mess that only time and distance could clean up. As I made my way back home, the whole night played over in my mind like a bad movie. I kept thinking about the girl I'd met just a week ago, the funny, smart, confident Melissa, who seemed so different from the one I'd spent the night. I couldn't help but wonder what had gone so wrong in her life to bring her to this point. But in the end, I knew it wasn't my place to fix her. Sometimes, people are just going through their own battles, and all you can do is step aside, and hope they find their way out. We never spoke again after that. I deleted her number the next day, figuring it was better to leave the whole experience in the past. Every once in a while, I'd hear her name mentioned in passing among our mutual friends, but I never asked for details. Some things are better left as mysteries.